Mia Rapson with the Canadian Press.
Hi, I'm hoping you could just sort of go over that again a little bit in English and what you're like wanting to see from the federal government over the next week. What would sort of precipitate you deciding that you're going to pull your support?
Well, so some of the key elements of the threat right now, we know that there are people that are waiting in the surrounding areas of Ottawa to return back to Ottawa. So that can't be the case. They need to be cleared out. We know there are people that are still hiding in Ottawa itself. There are many people that are supportive of this occupation that are still in Ottawa. And so the idea that there are funds being frozen for those folks that are participating in the convoy that are waiting to return, if it's clear that they've been moved out and that they're no longer able to return, that would be something that would indicate no support is no longer needed. We know that the financing in general, this is a group that was able to raise significant amounts of funds. We know just on two websites alone that close to 10 million on one and 5 million on another. So these are significant amounts of funding that have funded this movement. And we know a large portion of that is foreign funding, particularly from the States. So we want to see that funding question has been addressed. We know there's been attempts made at numerous targets still, that bridges have been targeted, that there's been convoys that have been intercepted coming from different parts of Canada to Ottawa or to bridges. That's another area of concern. And also, when we talk about our continued support, we want to see a commitment from this government that this type of emergency act doesn't apply to Canadians that are rightfully and legally raising their concerns. We're talking about workers fighting for fair conditions at work, or Indigenous community members raising concerns about their rights and their land rights, or environmental groups, or any Canadian, frankly, that's legally protesting. We want clear assurances that this type of measure is not used ever towards legal and rightful protests and those type of organizing efforts which are legitimate. This is a case without precedent, and I want it to be very clearly expressed that this is an attack on our democracy. This is a group of folks who are very clearly connected with the extreme right wing. The organizers clearly had a goal in mind of undermining democracy, and that's something that we cannot allow to continue. And so those are some of the things that we want to see, commitments that in the future this never be applied and never be used as a precedent for those other circumstances, and that those elements of concern are, once they're addressed, we'll be prepared to withdraw our support.
I'm also curious, the Conservatives many times over the last few days of debate have accused the NDP of sort of breaking with your roots. They're talking about Tommy Douglas's opposition to using the War Measures Act in 1970. I'm just wondering what you say in response to that, but also how do you determine what's legitimate protest and what's not? How do you decide that this is not legitimate instead of it just being people saying things that you disagree with?
Well, we can start with the legitimate protest. The protest that we've seen when people are fighting decisions of government, when they're targeted towards a law, a legislation, a decision of government specifically. It's very different, and the efforts in those cases are very different. They're targeting government decisions. They're targeting a piece of legislation. That's very different from what we've seen in this occupation, which targeted people, which targeted residents, which targeted families and children trying to go to school. The focus of the attention of the occupation has been on people, and that's wrong. That's from the outset. That was an illegal use of resources. What we also know when it comes to the difference between the Emergencies Act and the War Measures Act, there are vast differences. I spoke with Ed Broadbent, as you all know, a leader, and he was a member of Parliament when the War Measures Act, when the Emergencies Act was brought in, when he was instrumental in making sure that the new act was brought forward. And he himself said this clearly different, a completely different scenario, that the Emergencies Act responded to the overly broad, serious concerns against the War Measures Act, and we voted against the War Measures Act because of its overly broad and dangerous use of powers. The Emergencies Act was a response to that, very different, very limited in scope, limited in duration, limited in power. It does not include the military whatsoever. So it's a very different scenario with a very different set of powers. It's something that having spoken with that at Broadbent, something that he also supports as well, and something that we know that given this crisis, given the specific nature of it, these are specific powers to help us deal with this. It's very different.
Prochaine question. Hélène Buzetti, des coop de l'information.
Oui, bonjour, M. Singh. Alors, je comprends que ce soir, les troupes du NPD vont appuyer.
Sérieuse la menace de ce.
Prochaine question, Boris Cruz de moi.
Bonjour, M. Singh. Pour mettre fin au.
Okay, so my understanding is you're pretty confident all your MPs are going to be.
Next question, Catherine Lévesque with the National Post.
Yes, hi, Mr. Singh. Good afternoon. I wanted to know if you're going to allow a free vote within your caucus tonight, and if not, why?
I mentioned this before that our team is very reluctant. We've been reluctant since the beginning. All of us are. We consider this a very serious moment, and that using these powers is very serious. Given the real threat of the extreme right-wing organizers, the amount of funds that they have, we've taken a decision as a team. We will be supporting this reluctantly, and you'll see that our team is going to support this. And we're supporting it because we understand how serious this is and the serious threat this poses to Canadians.
Okay, so my understanding is you're pretty confident all your MPs are going to be unanimous in voting for the continuation of this. And I just want to hear you on the confidence vote. You said in French that you weren't surprised that tonight was going to be a confidence vote, but given the seriousness of the situation, do you think it's appropriate right now that the Liberals are, in a way, playing political games and kind of pressuring you in a sense to, and saying that this is a confidence vote and that if it does not pass, then the government goes into an election?
Well, I want to be clear on this point. We've always known that since the beginning that this was a confidence vote. I mean, if you compare the invocation of the Emergencies Act versus the throne speech, this is pretty serious. This is a very serious decision. So we've always known that, and we've based our decision based on how serious the crisis is, how seriously we take the threat of extreme right-wing organizers, and the threat of the amount of money that they have, and the threat to Canadians and our democracy. So we've always taken this very seriously, and our concern was that all levels of government failed to do so. They failed to take it seriously. And so our decision is based on the protection of Canadians. We've always known that this was an emergency vote. This vote was a vote of confidence. That is something that we understood right away, that this would naturally be a vote of confidence. And we understood absolutely that we do not want to trigger an election. That would be the worst thing to do in this crisis, that this would somehow also trigger an election. We would never allow that to happen. That would never be acceptable in our opinion. But we know that this is serious, and we're making this decision based on the seriousness of the threat to Canadians and to our liberty, to our democracy, and we take that as something that requires, again, our reluctant, but our support.
Next question, Jacques Galland from the Toronto Star.
Hi, Mr. Singh. My first question is about, given the fact that you are supporting this and ensuring that it will pass in the House tonight, how can you be so confident that this act won't be invoked again, either by this government or any government in the future, to crack down on the circumstances that you mentioned earlier where Canadians are rightfully raising their concerns?
We share those concerns. Those are legitimate concerns, and we want to be really clear. This is a situation without precedent, and it should not be in any way be used to infer that. The government should lay out specifically that this was extreme right-wing groups that were seeking to undermine our democracy. That is a very unique scenario. That is not something that we've seen before, and that's not something that is replicated when communities are raising their voices legitimately to fight government decisions that they think are going to hurt their communities, and that's something that we want to support. That should never be inferred by this scenario, which again, by its very nature, is very different. This is extreme right-wing organizers brazenly stating that their goal was to undermine democracy. They were clearly targeting and hurting residents. They were targeting families and people and small businesses. They were not targeting the government. It's very different from when we see legitimate protests that target government decisions, government policies, and when communities come together to do that. It's a very different scenario, and there is no way this should be used similarly. There will be court challenges. And those core challenges will test the criteria used. And that's an important tool also in our democracy of challenging or testing when an emergency act could be implemented. And I think that's an important part of our system that allows for a legal challenge and a legal test of the application of this law.
Thanks. And I'm wondering then, if you were Prime Minister, what would you have done? Would you have invoked the act, and would you have invoked it sooner?
Well, what we've said really clearly is, and what I've called on the Prime Minister a number of times, is as soon as this convoy made its intentions clear, they didn't hide the fact that they were coming to Ottawa. They didn't hide the fact that their memorandum of understanding clearly stated their intention to overthrow democracy. As soon as that was made clear, we would have taken it seriously. I would have taken it seriously as Prime Minister. I remember during the emergencies debate that she called for, this was about 12, 13 days into the crisis, the occupation in Ottawa, the Prime Minister had not yet met with Mayor at that point in time. And it was only on the day of the emergency debate that that meeting actually happened. I would have never allowed for a crisis of that nature to happen in the capital of our country without meeting with the local municipal authorities and providing every resource possible to deal with it. I would have never let it go 2 weeks to get to that point in the first place. And we've seen other cities that took it seriously, responded quickly, and were able to prevent any serious outcomes. Quebec City and Toronto, for example, were able to stop the convoy from getting out of hand. And so that's something that Ottawa and the Prime Minister and the provincial government, frankly, all failed to take into consideration how serious this was. The bridge as well was something that we saw very clearly. This was an attempt to, again, undermine our democracy and hurt workers and hurt jobs, and should never have been allowed to happen. The group is clear, their intentions were clear, and as soon as we saw any of these indications, as Prime Minister, I would have immediately responded and ended it before it got to the point that it's so serious now.